Hello everyone, welcome back to Intersections, Mission to Innovate. I'm Gracie Davidson and with me are Kuan Collins and Prachi Sutanka here at the Spark Studio. This episode kicks off the new year. Kuan and Prachi are talking about top 5 intersections for the year 2022 and beyond. Here they're talking about the social, economic, and technological trends that are emerging around us and some fascinating intersections between them. Understanding these intersections and the underlying themes of democratization, accessibility, and culture is the perfect recipe to thrive and innovate in this year 2022 and beyond. Hello everyone, welcome back. Happy New Year's. Welcome back to Intersections, Mission to Innovate. I'm here in the Spark Studio with Prachi and Kuan. I'm ready to get started, so I'm going to go ahead and kick it off to you, Kuan.
Thanks, Gracie. Hey, Prachi. Happy New Year, everyone.
Happy New Year.
We're so excited to be back. It was a great break, but I think we were excited to see, where we could take our podcast next. So thinking through this topic, we're kind of framing this as our version of New Year's resolutions. But, instead of New Year's resolutions that we don't really do anything with, we're sort of going to talk about trends and intersections that we've observed in work, in life, driven by the pandemic and COVID. What's getting changed? Like what's working, what's not working, what's getting transformed? What do you think about that, Prachi?
I love it. I think it's going to be our top 5 intersections for 2022 and beyond, right? That's how I'm thinking about it. And look, we love to think about New Year resolutions, right? Like I do, I'll admit it. But I know that they tend to be fleeting. They sort of, start full blown in the month of January and then they evaporate. Like think of like gyms, whether it's your home gym or going to a, gym outside. January, the attendance is packed, and then February, you start, the dropouts, right? So instead of resolutions, can we get to the core of how to sustain the type of culture and behavior that we want in our environments, how we want to innovate, and can we understand the patterns so that we can then make them part of our habits and make them part of our core? So I think that's our idea here, right?
Absolutely. I love the idea of patterns because I think that's key here. Going back to, how we defined intersections and this mission to innovate through resilience, empathy, critical thinking, the discussion of civil discourse, civility, friendship, creativity. I think those themes really resonated with us. And that's why we sort of, were inspired to think about all of that. So we want to see how we can identify those patterns that lead us to that kind of relationship and discourse that we want in a variety of different domains. And we believe that there is sort of a framework that we can set up that really helps each of those domains with being successful with achieving that culture of innovation. And so I think, as we think about how we will frame the discussion, the notion of democratization came to mind. And, from that, just that easy accessibility to tools. So, in previous episodes, we've talked about citizen developers, citizen scientists, basically like getting to everyone within your organization to help them with understanding what you're trying to accomplish and that they have a role in what you're trying to accomplish. And then through all of that, creating that culture where everyone in the organization has the potential to impact the future of that idea. So Prachi, let's start with intersection number 1. I think you were going to talk to us about smart and sustainable cities.
Absolutely, would love to. And speaking of democratization and accessibility, those are certainly the themes that we see here, right? And this is out of my personal interest and passion. I did a pretty in-depth research around what does it mean to, have smart and sustainable cities. And I'm going to steal some definitions from this certification that I did recently. It's by Smart Cities Council. If our listeners are interested, I would highly recommend that. But essentially, they lay out this framework where, the Smart Cities 1.0 movement started being all tech-driven, right? Let's put the sensors, let's collect the data, whether that's pollution or traffic management or what have you. It sort of evolved to this Smart Cities version 2.0, where it was more technology-enabled, but driven by the city officials and so on, right? And now there is this almost awakening and movement towards a version 3.0, which is citizen driven. And that's where I see some amazing intersections between the citizen engagement and not just engagement, but really ownership, right? Having ownership and a voice and a say into all of the activities and how your city, and we use the term city very loosely, it could be your community, your county, so how does that work? And that intersects with obviously additional aspects like the policies that are in place. Something that's closer to your and my heart, Kuan, is all about data-driven decision-making and evidence-based thinking, right? Like, what is the role of that? And then how do you even start by acquiring the right data sets for that, right? So now we are talking about this interesting intersection between citizen engagement, policy, evidence-based thinking, and there is more and more a really large focus and again awakening of sorts about building equity upfront into all of this, right? So to me, I think this trend, I think, is going to get mature, is going to evolve, and it's going to lead to, all kinds of interesting phenomena. And finally, we talk about the need for having sort of this hyper localization of solutions so that they're really relevant for that city, for that county, for that community. But then we also know that there are some common trends and patterns and issues around how do we do privacy, how do we introduce cybersecurity when there is lack of standardization across like these different cities, at a global level. How do we introduce that? So to me, it goes back to, I think, what we were discussing in an earlier episode. There is that ping pong between innovation and trust on one side and that open experimentation versus building some of these verification and security aspects, right? So all kinds of intersections in my mind. As you can see, it's exploding.
Thanks, Prachi. So the next intersection that I wanted to cover was software factories. So in some of our previous episodes, I've brought that up as a trend that we're seeing in a lot of different organizations to accelerate the pace at which they are bringing digital transformation and a variety of different technologies, better customer experience to their organizations. And it's through things like DevOps, DevSecOps automation, the creation of citizen developers and providing those kinds of tools, and certainly Web 3.0. So I'm seeing this intersection of public sector and private sector techniques, right? And this bringing together of non-traditional partnerships. So, instead of sort of going back to, the integrators or the companies that you typically do business, we're looking at startups, right? And learning from the startup culture and trying to adapt with, not only their culture, but their agility, the way they scale, their tools. And in addition to mimicking all of that, it's really, again, back to that democratization idea, bringing that expertise to everyone in your organization through low code, no code kind of tooling, and empowering, right? Empowering your organization, reskilling, upskilling, breaking down those barriers. So, I know like with AFWorks or, organizations like that within the government, they're trying to say that everyone in the organization has the potential to have an impact, has the potential to bring an innovation or bring an idea. Now, there are some issues, right? Like security in particular, what needs to be secure as everything goes into the cloud, this idea of impact levels, and that adds layers of complexity in terms of this democratization and working with non-traditional companies, because your startups aren't encumbered with those types of requirements. And so there's challenges there. And what you mentioned, Prachi, with respect to evidence-based thinking and critical thinking, I think that applies absolutely to this notion of what needs to be secure, right? So let's be thoughtful about exactly what information we're trying to protect, what data we're trying to protect, and not just blanket, requirement to say everything needs to be locked down, because that hampers this culture that we're trying to create and that democratization of the tooling. There's certainly national security issues, right? Privacy concerns, but I think we can get to a model where, it's that trust but verify,
Right.
Right, where we are allowing everyone in the organization and not only the organization, but our external non-traditional partners to participate and then lock down the things that we know we have to. Find models for that anyways.
And you know what strikes me is that in just like in our intersection one around smart and sustainable cities, we were drawing parallels about evidence-based thinking, cybersecurity. Those same aspects apply to this particular domain and model, right?
Yes.
So that to me is fascinating. And the other thing that struck me, Kuan, is that we are talking about intersections on the Intersections podcast, right? Like, I mean, I know it's late on a Friday evening and I'm like done for the week, but I'm pretty sure there is something meta going on like right here, right?
Absolutely.
And speaking of that, I think our intersections, top 5 intersections, could not be complete without a discussion around like Metaverse and NFTs and all of that, right?
Yes. So when I think about Metaverse, obviously that book and movie Ready Player One comes to mind, right? This notion that it's a dystopian future, but we all have this amazing life in the Metaverse.
Right.
And I also think about gaming. So I think this topic came up when I was talking to my son. He's a video gamer, and every new game always, he has to follow it up with, not only am I going to play the game, but I'm going to modify the game. Right. And there's this whole community now where that's the norm. So you don't accept a game, the way it's been designed. You take it, you break it, you figure out how to hack it, and you create this whole community around modifications of the game. And it's fascinating to me. I think that goes back again to our theme here of democratization, right? Like, let the crowd tell you what they want to do with the idea that you've presented to them. And it actually, it's empowered the community. It creates its own sort of marketing engine, right? Because people are talking about the game and there's buzz around the game and there's new development that you didn't even think about to begin with. So it's this sort of organic, managed by the crowd collaboration and trust. And I think it's a great phenomena, and it's teaching, I think back to upskilling and reskilling, right? The youth, how to program, how to develop, how to communicate with each other. There's YouTube channels upon YouTube channels about how to modify all of these things. And then as we think about extending that to the metaverse, right, the idea of NFTs, the non-fungible tokens, and digital art, this blows my mind, right? That now we're going to have very, multi-million-dollar pieces of art that exist in a digital form in this metaverse. And that's the new investment model, and that we're going to buy land in digital planets. And it's a whole new way of thinking, right? And
it is
all built around blockchain. Back to, how do we secure things, right? Where there is this digital software mechanism to help with the security aspect of it and the democratization of that security.
It's absolutely fascinating. And, it's not just even the marketing engine. What fascinates and boggles my mind is the economic and wealth creation engine, right? And speaking of, use of crypto networks and blockchain in an interesting way, something that I just heard, listen to this TED talk by Traber Scholes, and he's a big advocate of what's called a platform co-ops organizational model, right? We are all familiar with the basic notion of a food co-op. What they are doing though is that they're applying it to all kinds of other sectors. So for example, there is a company called Fairbnb, right? Where it's the BNB model, but applied in a co-op fashion. And what that means is that not only do all the employees have a say into the operational decision-making, they also own the digital property, the digital platform. So it's a combination of the co-op model and the digital platforms. And then obviously, at the heart of that is the use of crypto networks and blockchain to make that happen. And I thought that was just super interesting and transformative. Right?
That reminds me of the other thing that we mentioned, this idea of collaborative consumption. So when platforms like Netflix and Airbnb and Zipcar or Uber, right, came into play, it's sort of that the notion of platform co-ops made me think of that, because it's really about the tech innovation, right? Shifting this value to, do I need my own vehicle, or do I need my own, place to stay, or can I now share it with a number of people and everybody gets to benefit from the item that we're now sharing? The economic realities of that, right? So then, to your point about like wealth creation, but also sharing in the wealth. And then the environmental pressures, like, so now, especially in the automobile industry, ride sharing and no longer needing your own vehicle, because 90% of the time you're probably not even driving it. So yeah, I think there's a lot going on there, from not only the platform side of it, but then this whole virtual, reality piece to it. I think it's a huge intersection in terms of where this is going. So back to equity, because I think that's another theme, right? And within the democratization, how does this apply then for intersection number 4 around this trend with diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Yeah, great question. And, when we spoke about equity in the context of smart cities and sustainable cities, it was more around, hey, are we catering to all the different demographic segments of a particular community or a city, right? And how do we get their voice heard? Here, I think, when we talk about DEI, it's more from an organizational construct. So our bounding, box now is an organization, right? But just like with the sustainability piece, with DEI, I think there is a strong conversation around, is this being done more as a checklist exercise, or is it truly doing what it's supposed to? And in a way, Kuan, I think that aligns with all of our conversations around how do you start with whatever your enablers are, whether that's technology, whether that's, having conversations and forums, and really tie that to the outcomes that you are ultimately looking for, right? And so the question becomes, I think, even for DEI, how do you move from strategy to execution? And then perhaps back to strategy again, because it's always that incremental and iterative cycle, right? And I know I'm throwing some agile terms here, but it absolutely fits. It may not be intuitive, right? But that's our interesting intersection. It's an intersection of agile and scientific thinking with the whole topic of DEI. I mean, I don't know if it's been discussed from that lens, but I think there is an absolute place to introduce, again, scientific, evidence-based thinking into the DEI space, right?
I couldn't agree with you more. And I feel like at least what we're seeing in sort of social media and the news and everything, I don't think we're seeing any agile thinking with respect to the messaging, right? We're seeing reactions, we're seeing sort of this broad strokes around what it means, to apply DEI. And it's almost a little bit of theater as opposed to, did we actually solve the problem? And what is the problem, first of all? So I think, employing, back to your point about critical thinking, human-centered design thinking, let's start with the problem that we're trying to solve, because I think there's a lack of clarity with everyone. We're not on the same page about what DEI means to us as institutions, as individuals, as different ethnic backgrounds, different genders, right? I think it's there's so much to unpack in what we're trying to accomplish. And I think an agile method would help with at least clarifying what we're trying to accomplish.
And look, I mean, you and I are proponents of agile and design thinking. That's not to say, okay, let's just apply that everywhere blindly. But the point is that there is a very core philosophy, right, behind the agile thinking. So let's embrace that. There are some very simple, very core principles where it says, figure out what that increment is that's actually going to generate the value, implement that, right? So again, go from strategy to execution and then iterate on that. And to me, that's such a simple principle that I can pretty much apply that to any problem in my life or others' lives, right?
What I like about the agile philosophy too is that it promotes that discourse, that discussion, and that understanding of stakeholder and implementer as well. So it's not just, I'm going to go off and solve your problem. I'm going to spend so much time getting feedback and understanding and documentation around what it is we're trying to get out of this engagement. So continuing on our theme of agile thinking and applying our patterns of intersections, intersection number 5 is going to take us into space.
Woo!
What's more exciting than that? And so over the holidays, I know we were all watching, right, as the Virgin Atlantic CEO and Amazon CEO just amazed us and entertained us with their commercialization of going to space and democratizing the idea that maybe one day we could be part of that. And this idea of space tourism and thinking through, do I want to go to space? What's that going to be like? And, it's an amazing future to think about, right? Because this is something I think that was completely not accessible before, but was fascinating. Like we've always been fascinated with the next frontier, right? And it's becoming much more possible for us to think through that. And as I work with agencies like NASA, they are changing the way that they are thinking about their missions to the moon again and to Mars, and certainly the partnerships with companies like SpaceX and Orbital and Blue Origin are demanding a new way of doing business, right? A more agile method of space engineering and space travel, and working with non-traditional partners. So creating the equivalent of a software factory, but now for building the next space rockets and the next space payloads, and thinking through what that whole industry needs to look like. So without, getting into too much about, the details around that domain, but what's exciting here with this intersection is that the future is here, right? That we can absolutely be thinking about how we can participate as a community in figuring out what that space tourism industry can look like.
Yeah, that's absolutely the exciting part. And I also think that, even here we have that intersection of civil and federal space going on, not to, use the term space again, but the other intersection is also like that traditional space travel, which was all about technology and safety and, having that reserved for a certain set of people, with tourism, right? I mean, that alone, I think, is going to open all kinds of conversations and opportunities. So, Kuan, I can't believe that we have gone from talking about smart and sustainable cities to software factories to Metaverse and NFTs. And then we jumped to DEI, and then, we wrapped it up with our space travel conversation. And I have to say that I hope everyone takes away a few things from here, right? And the whole point is that, when we talk about democratization, accessibility, culture, all these are very, very cross-applicable aspects to all kinds of problem spaces, all kinds of domains, different technological advancements. And I mean, that's sort of the whole point of intersections. Something else, I think, when we think of democratization and accessibility, there is this absolute notion or underlying theme around openness. And I'm going to go on a limb here and coin a term. I don't know whether that's mainstream or not, but it's openness of everything. And it's openness of thought, openness of being able to share that in a trusted and verifiable way. It's openness around tools and technologies. It's openness within and across organizations and communities. And ultimately, it's about breaking those barriers, breaking those silos in order to achieve the outcomes. And I know outcomes, sounds very businessy, but it's really about making yourself and in turn, the world a little better. So my final thought here, it's been an amazing conversation, Kuan, as usual, but I would love to quote Sarah Blakely, a huge fan. I know you are too. She talks about aiming high, right? Or aiming higher. And I mean, there is a true story and a video that you all can look up, but it's about this retreat that she attends with Richard Branson and other entrepreneurs, where she literally makes a high jump so that she does not fall into a valley, but then hangs on to this, person who's hanging off of a pulley, right? She shares that in her masterclass, and it's like, it gave me goosebumps when I watched that video. But the point here is aim higher and you will get somewhere, right? And it's not about necessarily like monetary goals or whatever. If that's what it is, that's fine. But it could be any kinds of goals. set those goals, aim high, then double the goals from there, right? Like add a little one in front of your number or a zero at the back of your number or whatever it is. But I think it's about that positivity that comes from thinking about aiming higher.
I love that. And just to add to that, as we thought about, creating these intersections and thinking about the trends that we're observing, I couldn't help but think back historically about how different groups innovated and the patterns that we see in things like the Renaissance artists or the authors in Oxford University called the Inklings with J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, and them finding their tribe, finding their group of friends that would help them to think about things differently and to help them mature their ideas and mature the products that they wanted to create in the community, a community that wasn't ready for them. So what I want to charge everyone with, in addition to aiming high, is to find your tribe and create your intersection. And let's innovate more together in 2022.
I think that wraps up Intersection's Mission to Innovate episode 4. I believe this is probably my favorite episode yet. I cannot wait for more. Make sure you're staying connected with us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at UAHI2C. Bye everyone, onward and upward.